Fort Mill, South Carolina at the American Ex-Prisoner of War, Department of South Carolina Convention. Our interview this afternoon is with Mr. Charles Hill from Columbia, South Carolina. Mr. Hill was held during the Korean War by the Chinese, and we'll be discussing his experiences as a prisoner of war. Let me go ahead and thank you for joining us this afternoon and spending some time
Thank you.
with
It's
us.
my pleasure.
If you would, let's just begin by telling us where you lived and your occupation prior to enlistment.
I lived in Columbia. I was born in Columbia. I lived there up until the time I entered service, which was January 42, right after Pearl Harbor, and made a career out of the service, 24 years, around the world, around the U.S., and
Go ahead and tell me a little bit about your military career, just briefly an outline.
well, I started out, as all of us did, with the ground forces, Army Air Corps. I went to what is now the Columbia Municipal Airport, was the Columbia Army Air Base at the time. And from there to Louisiana, Atlanta, Georgia. That's a long time ago. Jackson, Mississippi Ordnance Plant, actually, north of Jackson, Mississippi. Back to Atlanta again. Camp Crowder, Missouri, where I went through training, communications training, teletype, and over to Europe in World War II. I spent between 18 and 20 months over in Europe in World War II, France, Germany, some of the smaller countries, just through them. Back to the States, assigned to Robins Air Force Base, and was there in 47 when the unification of the services took place, and we had the option of either staying in the Army or moving into the Air Force when it became a separate service. So I chose the Air Force. From there, I went to Dobbins Air Force Base in Atlanta. Again to Shreveport, Louisiana, and then over to, no, I went to Savannah, Georgia, to Hunter Air Force Base, then to Louisiana, and then to Okinawa, where we flew missions over Korea. We were supposed to fly 6 missions. That was the required number of missions to fly, and then you could be rotated home. There was no time element. I was on mission 5.5, and that's as far as I got.
Tell me about the circumstances surrounding your capture and that mission.
I was on B-29. I was operating the radar, the jamming, the anti-aircraft, anti-searchlight radar to try to protect the mission, the aircraft. And we got hit by MiGs that, I'm sure, because we knew that some were equipped with airborne intercept radar, which we had no way of jamming. We didn't have that kind of equipment. And the aircraft started down when we got hit. One got us in the nose, the other one ripped us up from the tail, and we started down. I lost my oxygen mask and passed out. I came to, and it was awfully cold, and I was outside. And I had fallen out of the aircraft. It had obviously broken it. Well, I won't say obviously. One of the other two who got out of it told me that that's how he got out, and he was still conscious when he did. It broke where we were sitting. One of the two gunners told me this, and I rode the parachute to the ground. It was all the straps had been torn off my leg harness, and everything was up under my arms, and I rode down to the ground. My leg had been shot and twisted badly with the equipment that collapsed on me when we nosed over. I wasn't able to walk and didn't know where I'd walk anyway in the middle of the night. On the way down, I figured I had it made. All this nice water down there, moon shining on it, and I knew that Chodo Island was just off the coast where our target was that night. And I had the code, I had the little one-cell flashlight and all of this, and we had a rescue outfit on Chodo. Expected to get picked up, getting back to the base somehow. Closer I got to that water, the stranger it looked. I discovered it was rice paddies. That's where I landed. And being November in the mountains of Korea, it was cold, so I just wrapped up in the parachute to keep warm. And the next morning, a young Korean boy, they knew, of course, in the village nearby that an aircraft had come down. And this Korean boy, out looking for what he could find, found me. He took off and came back with some of the old home guard. One of them had a rifle that looked like he might have gotten it from Daniel Boone, a long seemingly muzzle-loading gun. And they hauled me away. I still wasn't able to walk, and these shorter-than-I Koreans dragging me wore the toes out of my shoes with my arms draped over their shoulders while they hauled me off. They kept me a short while, and then...
Were there any, do you remember any initial thoughts once the home guard came up? Anything in particular go through your mind at that point?
Well, they expected, because most flyers did have the old 45, usually in a leg pocket of a flying suit or a leg holster or something, and they swore I had one hidden somewhere. I mean, they couldn't talk to me. I couldn't understand them, but they indicated that I had this thing, and they searched me and so on. And what I figured, as far as safety or something like that, if that's what you're asking, was concerned, I made it to the ground. I was going to make it home. I didn't know when, but I'd make it home. The only one time that became doubtful was one place I was held, and this interrogator, Chinese at this time, told me I was of no use to him. I wouldn't answer his questions. He said, "You've lived long enough. Get up and go outside." And he had a .32. He stuck right at the end of my nose. I knew there was a guard outside, and he had one of the submachine guns, burp guns. I had seen him through a hole in the paper covering the window. And I didn't know that I would get very far, but I knew that one of them was going to go with me. I got over to the door, and he says, "Come back and sit down." So I knew I had the upper hand then with him, and that's the way it went.
So throughout your time, it sounds like you maintained a positive attitude.
Oh, yeah. But that was the one time if he's serious about this, this might be it. But when he said, "Come back and sit down," he had lost. And that's the way I went with all of the interrogators from then on. I played mental chess with them. They asked me a question, and I'd give them an answer. Not a right one, but an answer. That came about when I said I wouldn't answer their questions. This same guy brought a guardian with him, and when he'd ask me a question, military information question, I'd give him name, rank, serial number. And he'd signal to the guard, and I'd get the butt of a rifle on the back of my head. If I got too much of it and passed out, I got a dish of cold water in the face, and he'd start over with his questions. So that's when I started talking, but not telling him anything.
How long was it before you were turned over by the Koreans who made the initial contact, to the military?
It was probably a week, 10 days, but I was on the move constantly. They took me through Seoul and stopped at various little villages along the way, and we got to Seoul, and there were more Russian troops in that town at that time than Koreans. They were all over the place. But at about that time, they turned me over to the Chinese.
How old were you?
20, let's see.
Or maybe I should say how young were you?
Well, it wasn't 20, it was 30. See, this was 52. I was 31 years old.
Okay, and your rank at the time?
Lieutenant. First lieutenant.
What type of training had you received on how to react or what to expect if you became a prisoner of war?
I had no training. I just had been told the Geneva Convention says you give name, rank, serial number. I found out later you can give date of birth, but now I don't know what they do. That's been a long time. But that's all I gave them, and I knew because of the training I had had, the job I was doing at the time, that there was classified information that I was not to divulge, and I just played it that way. They were the enemy, and I wasn't going to help them.
And you were captured on November the...
Today, November the 8th, I was captured in 1952.
Not exactly the type of anniversary that you celebrate.
I can smile about it now, but I thought about it on the way over here. I meant to mention it to my wife and forgot, but it was the 8th of November, 52.
So is that something that you think about every year?
No,
on this date?
unless for some reason I'm thinking, this is November the 8th. It doesn't occur to me, no.
But what type of treatment did you receive in that week that the Koreans had you?
I was kept in one little place where they held a kangaroo court and went out, built a scaffold, told me that by sign language and so on, and one little Korean boy could speak some English, and told me that next morning that's where I was going to be swinging. Next morning they moved me on to the next town, but as we went along the way from one village to another, the older women would come out with sticks, some of them 1.5 inches, 2 inches in diameter, and pound on me. Of course, I was in my flying suit, and it was obvious that I wasn't native over there. And they'd pound on me and the words Pishiku, Pishiku, which was their word for the B-29. I found out later. I didn't know what it was, but I heard it often enough that I remembered it. They didn't do anything. They'd give me a little bit of food here and there and so on. The Chinese were a little bit better in the feeding department, except one time, and that's when this guy would threaten to shoot me. I went 12 days that all I got for nourishment was to reach through the hole in that window and grab a handful of snow and suck on it. I got no food. When I was lucky, I got a bowl of rice a day, about a 4-inch diameter bowl. And again, it was going to keep me going. I was sure of that.
Where were you taken once you turned over to the Chinese?
Somewhere I could see going into the place, and I had one of the hairiest rides I have ever had in a Jeep on mountain roads, hairpin roads around mountains, and they're going at full throttle, and all they do is blow the horn before they swing around the curve, and if they don't hear a horn from the other way, they figure it's theirs. But I was
survived the crash and everything, and now you're worried about.
Yeah, I'm gonna get killed in the Jeep accident. But this was up at the Yalu. They took me all the way up to the Yalu, and in fact, at one time, the Chinese took me across the Yalu, and in a huge area, acres and acres of land, there are little shacks that would look like an outhouse. I think they were storage for crops, whatever, forage for the livestock. They told me, we'll put you in one of those, and you'll never leave. You'll spend the rest of your life in one of those little buildings if you don't cooperate with us. I said, so what can I do? I can't walk away and leave you. It's up to you. You're going to put me in there? Put me in there. I've told you all I know. And they brought me back to the other side. But I lost over 100 pounds in a year.
Did they provide or any medical treatment?
No. No, my left leg was shot up. I was hurt again when I hit the ground. There were sharp, dried stalks along the divisions in the rice paddies, and my leg got, the calf of my leg in this case, got a big hole punched in it, and I got absolutely nothing. They provided no medical treatment whatsoever.
So where were you held? They threatened to put you in those.
This was in the storage room of a house in a Korean village. That's the only place that I was kept. One here, moved me to another village and put me in there, and so on.
Did they ever, or any of the guards, anybody ever tell you what they were doing, or why they were moving you around, or where you were going?
No.
Any of them?
No. One of the interrogators, and here again is my playing mental chess with them. One of the interrogators seemed like a fairly decent sort, but we got talking one day, and he and I got on the subject of tea, and instead of getting answers from me, he explained to me the different types of tea that they grow there, and at what different times of the year they harvest different types of tea. Well, he left with an empty pad, no notes on it at all. They all spoke very good English, the Chinese. Another time, I didn't see him for about a week, and he came back, and this time he says, this is business. This is serious business. And I led the conversation around to American automobiles and learned from him that he was partial or fond of, I guess, I don't know, maybe he had learned his English in the States, but he was fond of Studebakers. I had owned a Studebaker a few years prior to this, and I told him all about it and everything and how much I liked it, and we spent the rest of the time talking about Studebakers. He never did come back. I may have sent him off to the front lines by doing that. I don't know, but I felt bad about that because he was a fairly decent sort.
How often were you questioned or interrogated?
There was a period there of probably 3 months. This is after I got up to the Yalu. About 3 months. They'd start at first light, and one would come in and start talking to me. Before he'd leave, there'd be 1 or 2 more outside waiting. They worked on me in shifts until dark because they brought no lights into the building. They had to depend on daylight to make their notes. And this went on for about 3 months. They kept it all day. I mean, from dark to dark. I used to see another thing. I'd punch a hole in the paper over the window and look outside to see what I could around the village. And I knew that there were other prisoners kept in rooms like I was. And they would have little runners, Chinese, go over there, and they'd have armloads of books and magazines. And I asked about that. I'd see people delivering magazines and books around here. I know there are prisoners in these other buildings. I don't have any. What about that? No, we don't have any for you. Okay. Well, just prior to my going to, and I neglected this, I had been stationed at Waco, Texas at Connally Air Force Base, and a group of us Air Force types jumped on the chance that was offered by Daniel Sternberg, Dean of Music at Baylor University, who was a native Russian from Moscow. And he offered Russian language, spoken, written, and we took it. I had a B-plus average when I left there. I didn't have enough time in the course to get any kind of credit for it, but I was able to read and pronounce. The pronunciation was one of the big things we got from him. Well, I looked around the wall, and the houses are mud walls reinforced with straw, and they usually stick newspaper on them while the mud is still wet, not quite dry, is a better way of saying it. And this room in this particular building I was in was plastered with Pravda. And next time this particular interrogator came by, I said, "You sure you can't find something for me to read that's written in English? I'm tired of reading these newspapers on the wall here." He looked at me, he got up and went over to the wall, stuck his nose up real close to it, looked at it. He said, "Read that." Well, the date line was Stockholm, and I couldn't translate it, but I could read it and pronounce it exactly as it was written, thanks to Dean Sternberg, and I read that off in a half hour. I had a stack of magazines and 2 books. They never questioned me again. I'd finish a book and give it back to them, and here'd come another one.
But did you ever
in one village where I was, the room where I was kept, there was a slope down to a stream that went through, and I was allowed to walk down there to wash my face in the stream. I don't know how many cattle were kept upstream, but I'd go down there and wash my face in the mornings, and way up high on the other side in a compound that had a picket fence around it, I mean pickets like 8-foot spiked saplings, there was a group of prisoners, and I would see them, and they would yell and wave and so on. And one day I was sitting in the door. I could sit in the doorway to get some fresh air when it was warmer weather. And over across there, I see these guys, and the clothing they gave us was a quilted clothing, blue outside, white inside when they first gave it to us. And the cap was the same thing. It was like a baseball cap. And inside it was white. And this guy's standing over there with his cap, and he's opening it and closing it and flashing Morse code at me. So it finally clicked what was happening over there, and I'd get mine and I'd sit there, and we would communicate that way. They wanted to know news from the States since I had been shot down later than any of them. Most of them were Air Force. But this was the only contact until the thing was over and they started combining people and moving them south to be exchanged, Panmunjom. But I saw them at a distance. That was it. And they would bring these guys from across the creek, they would bring them over to a theater. They even let me go to the theater once, but they kept me isolated from this group. And they showed a movie. It was no English subtitles, so I don't know anything about it. But they marched right by the building I was in several times before the time that I was allowed to go also.
What length of time were you a prisoner for?
Just at a year, a little better than a year.
And the entire time you were
Solitary confinement.
So, do you know why they kept you alone the entire time and never allowed any contact with others?
Because I was, to use their term and to try to say it the way they did, I was a reactionary. I would not cooperate with the CPW, or Chinese People's Volunteers, which is what they meant. But as they said it, you do not cooperate with the CPW. Well, not much you or I can do about that. And that's where I stayed, and that's, I'm sure, why I stayed like that. I was as well satisfied at that. I got some rough treatment at the outset, but later on, when and one time too, I did make an attempt to escape. There was a young Korean fellow who said he would help me get away and get back to the lines, and I untied him, and he ran out the door and disappeared into the night. And I went out looking around for him, and couldn't find him. And going between all of the little buildings there in the place, I got turned around. So rather than go prowling and take a chance on being shot, I started yelling. And they came to where I was and took me back inside. Want to know where he was? I said, he told me go with him, and I went out and I didn't see him, and I don't know where he went. So I got in trouble for that. But toward the end, they pretty much just kept me around, still interrogated all the way through. They interrogated and threatened.
As far as getting in trouble, what the, is that, I mean, do they, does that involve beatings or anything?
Other than the guy with the rifle butt and the women with the sticks, there was no actual abuse like that, but from just at the top of my chest down to at least the waist, I've got little white spots from the point of a bayonet. The same guy used the other end of that rifle instead of the butt, and he would hold that right there until I would talk to him. And he might just punch 3 or 4 times on one question. But most times I would get the point of it, and he kept it pretty sharp. And he would punch it in and hold it there until I spoke to the interrogator. And he would wave him off, and he'd back up.
We talked a little bit about the interrogations. How much, in any indoctrination attempts, was there?
I read a number of books that were printed for consumption to brainwash, and they tried that most all of the time I was there. Lots of writings that were slanted to their side, and this was plentiful. Once they started giving me something to read, the first thing they brought me was Tolstoy's War and Peace. That was the first book they brought me, and they had some pretty slanted material that they furnished.
Would they question you on the material they provided?
No, they were after military information. That's all they wanted out of me.
And since they didn't get anything, are you kind of surprised that they continued as often and as long as they did?
They seemed a rather persistent bunch. They didn't give up. They just kept on and on and on. One thing they wanted, and they did bring some manuals, a lot of equipment that we had provided, the U.S. had provided to the Koreans, the South Koreans, was captured when they were overrun by the North Koreans and the Chinese. And they'd bring in these maintenance manuals that went to this equipment. I'd seen them during my years in service. And they said, we know these were left behind to confuse us. We want you, since you were in electronics, which I didn't tell them, but one of the 2 others that got out of the airplane, I told them I was an administrative officer along for the ride and just happened to get shot down. One of the 2 that got out of there told them I was electronics. That's when things started tightening the screws on me. Well, I looked at these manuals, and they said, you correct them. They'd have killed themselves if they had done what I told them to do with some of this electronic equipment. But it was a pastime, and it kept them off of my back.
Were you ever allowed any correspondence?
No, I wrote. I was allowed to write, but it was, I'm sure they thought, I'm going to tell things that they want to know, and they'll just keep these letters and go through them and so on. Nothing ever got back here. My wife wrote, and we had agreed before I went over, because anytime you go, there's a possibility of this. And we had agreed that we would make a consecutive numbering system for the letters that we wrote. Today's letter is number 1. Tomorrow's or next week's is number 2, or whatever. She wrote over 250, and I never got one. She sent pictures of the kids, one kid I had then. All kinds of correspondence, and nothing ever got to me. She never got anything of mine. And where it went, I don't know.
Were you ever forced to do any type of work?
One time, I don't even know where this was now, but this was snow up above my knees, and the hillside was about a 45-degree angle, and they had cut down a tree or a number of trees and cut up logs for either cooking or heating or both. And they needed these logs hauled down to the village. So I went up there, and they picked up these logs, put one on each shoulder for me to hold on to, and I was to go down the side of the hill in the snow. I had no proper clothing. I was wearing tennis shoes, which is all they gave me. Never any other kind of shoes after they wore the toes out of my flying boots. They wanted me to walk down, and I figured, okay, I'll try. I took about 15 steps and tripped on something that I couldn't see below the snow and fell, and these 2 logs went rolling down there. They were good-sized logs. They must have been a foot in diameter and about 2 feet long. They were not lightweight. And I had been sitting for quite a while, totally inactive. And then they decide suddenly, I'm going to be slave labor. Well, I was told, pick them up, pick them up. No way. I'm not taking them down there. Now, you're going to shoot me? Shoot me. That's it. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to walk down the hill and go back to the room where you keep me unless you stop me with a bullet before I get there. And that's what I did. Part of my coming down in the parachute, to go back a little bit, the leg straps had been torn off and everything piled up under my arms. It also caught under the shoulder blades, and my one arm was totally useless for about 3 months. When I got to the ground, I cut off a piece of shroud line of the chute and made a sling to hold my arm, but I had to pick it up with one hand and put it in the sling because I couldn't lift the one arm to get into the sling. But this was right at the outset.
You've already touched on not having adequate clothing.
Yeah.
What was, elaborate a little bit more on the food during your time in captivity. You mentioned that earlier time period, how long you went without food. But when you got food, what did it usually consist of?
A bowl of rice, sometimes something that I assumed was meat, but I couldn't positively identify it, and something that must have been bean curd made into a soup-like mix, and when I saw that and figured that's bean curd, soybean, that's healthy, So I ate every bit of it. I didn't like the taste, but it's better than nothing. One time, they brought me some soup, and I started into it, and it was crunchy. And it was shrimp that were not more than an inch long. I finally looked down in there and moved things around, and little pairs of black eyes looking up at me out of the soup. But it was food, something that wasn't in abundance.
As time got closer to your repatriation, did the food or treatment change?
Yes, they both improved. They both improved. We began to get meat. We began to get more food, and of course we were just there, being held until we could be exchanged down the road. They didn't bother us with anything. No interrogation, certainly, and no harsh treatment. It was just, you're here, we'll take you down eventually, and that's it.
Did you know, you could sense something was changing, I'm sure, since the treatment and everything changed. Did they give you information or tell you what was happening or in the works?
Eventually. Now, I was out I was one of the last ones out. Again, it might have been my being a reactionary that kept me to the end. General Dean came out a few days after I did. So I was right at the tail end. He was, I think, the last day of exchange.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about the exchange and the process.
Well, this is an amusing bit. They put us on trains, boxcars, to take south for exchange. And they had little engine and didn't want to lose the engine. So they made a pusher engine out of it, and they'd run up to a trestle over a river, trestle being a bit shaky, compliments of our Air Force, and they would stop the engine right there at the beginning of the trestle and let the cars roll out, the string of cars roll out over the trestle. From the other side, an engine would back in and couple up to the car that made it across the river and pull it on down that way, but the engine was too heavy and too valuable to risk getting out on that trestle and dumping it in the river. But they took us down and exchanged us. It was nothing great. They took us down. We got out of the train, got into trucks, and we were taken to the exchange point, and we came through. Of course, they made sure we weren't taking anything out that they didn't want us to take out. And they exchanged us. We went in. We went straight into hot showers and good meals and good clothing. And
how extensive was the debriefing?
They didn't, well, they did a lot of that, but we got down to Incheon to come home. We were getting on a hospital ship to bring us home. I got on board the ship and got awfully sick. I had fever 105. And right there in Incheon Harbor, they took me off and back in to the local hospital that they had there. Then flew me to Tokyo General Hospital. They thought I had hemorrhagic fever. It wound up I had malaria. Now, after I got back to the States, I talked to some of the guys that had written that hospital ship. And they said it was a pretty thorough debriefing. They didn't bother with us. I stayed in the hospital there several days. Then they flew us, several of us that had been patients there. As far as Hawaii, we had 2 or 3 days in Honolulu, and then they flew us on into San Francisco, arriving at the same time the ship did, because in that way they timed it that everybody that started out together wound up together, and then we went on our own separate ways from there. But one other interesting thing, 2 weeks after I got home, my wife got papers from the VA to collect my insurance. That's how much they knew about me. I answered the VA. I sent my comments back to them. I said, now, if this is a gift, thank you, but I'm not going to claim it and owe you the money.
That's really why you were not put through a long debriefing, so they figured you'd come.
No, the Americans debriefed the people on board the boat, the hospital ship. Where we were going as patients in the hospital, they weren't set up for that kind of debriefing. And I guess a handful of people missing from that ship wouldn't have made that much difference in the overall accumulation of information.
What was the date of your exchange? Date?
I'm not sure. I just can't tell you. It's right close to a year, right at a year.
What would you say was the hardest part about being a prisoner of war?
Not being able to let my family know that I was alive and eventually would make it. At least that's the way I felt. That was the hardest part. And not being able to go at it one-on-one with those people. That would have been a better deal as far as I'm concerned.
How would you say that your experience as a prisoner of war has affected your life?
I have used this statement when I've been asked that before. When I first wound up in solitary confinement and realized I was going to be there a while, I decided that I wasn't in very good company. And with a lot of time to sit, I did some thinking, evaluating of me, and I feel like I adjusted. And by the time they turned me loose, I wouldn't have been bad company to be with in solitary confinement. I think that it made me look at things in a different way. I think before that, it had been mostly me. And me wasn't doing anything for me, but there were others. And another thing I did while I was there, I tried to remember everything that I had to memorize, to recite in school. I mean, this is from grammar school on up, as far as it went that we had to do things like that. And I kept going over and over and over and kept it all in my head. I also kept a mental calendar, and I didn't miss one day. Not one day of the week or the date of the time. I knew without anybody having to tell me what day this was. And I just kept my mind active, which I think helped me to cope with them and their attempts at brainwashing and all of the interrogation I went through. Also, sitting thinking about family back here, I started putting together something in the form of a verse about this one and that one and the other one. And in addition to going over things that I'd learned much earlier, like Casey at the Bat and Paul Revere's Ride, things like this, I kept repeating these things in my head. And I would have the one pretty well fixed, and then I'd think about somebody else and start doing one for them. And after I got home, I typed them all out on paper. It was something to keep my brain active and to keep me from thinking about, here you are. Now, when I came to in that parachute, we flew in a bomber stream. We staggered the altitude of the aircraft, but rather than the big formation of World War II, we were in a string, but with staggered altitudes. And people joke about getting off a train in some ghost town, and just as you come back to get on the train again, you see the taillights going down the track. Well, I saw the exhaust on these aircraft going off across the sky, and here I was headed for the ground. No way to catch up with them.
Well, it sounds like there are a variety of things that probably contribute to getting you through your ordeal and back home. And you touched upon some my thoughts of your family, positive thinking. Anything else you would like to add to the list?
Faith is probably the most important. I'm a Catholic. As I say, I kept up with the dates, and everything else, and I knew when Lent was coming, and for all that they provided me with some of this, gosh, awful, I smoked at the time, this awful tobacco, which was mostly the stems of tobacco plants, or maybe just plain old weeds, I don't know what, but for Lent, I gave up my cigarettes, except on Sunday, because Sunday is not considered part of Lent. But for the 40 days, except for Sundays, I didn't have a cigarette. And there wasn't a whole lot to do. They gave me what we'd call the old mimeograph paper, this very coarse paper, to roll cigarettes. I never could roll a cigarette, even with cigarette papers. So one time I got outside, I got a piece of bamboo from joint to joint. And, of course, it's tapered. So I would roll a piece of paper around this stick, wet it, let it dry and seal, and then slide it off the small tapered end. Pinch one end and drop the tobacco down into the thing and tamp it in with the same stick. That was what I wound up doing. But first, I tried rolling in this paper. And I folded more than rolled and left big air pockets. And I got 2 haircuts in that year. And they took hand clippers and started at the side of my jaw and went all the way around my head, got the beard, the hair, everything, twice in a year. But one time I took care of it because this folded cigarette, when it hit an air pocket in there between the tobacco, blazed up. It singed the end of this long nose and burned off all of the growth on the front of my face.
That's one way to do it. So Liz, I want to go ahead and wrap up because we're going to get you out here right on time. But any final comments that you'd like to add? Go right ahead.
I'd go back again if it would keep this country from the domination of people like that. It's too bad that the general feeling that I see in this country today doesn't seem to care.
Like you have a truer understanding of freedom than a lot of other people.
Yes, sir, I certainly do. And it's something that until you lose it, you don't really appreciate it. Like missing the water when the well runs dry. It's the same thing, but it's something that is very precious, very valuable.
And I know so it's your time, and I appreciate you sharing it with us.
Thank you very much.